Shall I? Can I start by thanking everybody for coming along to our seminar tonight? But I'm delighted to welcome John Weeks. John Weeks is Professor Emeritus of Development Economics and former Director of the Center for Development Policy and Research at SOAS School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His most recent book, and he's published a great deal, but his most recent one is Economics of the 1%, How Mainstream Economics Serves the Rich, Obscures Reality, and Distorts Policy, unquote. And this was published in 2004. Now, John's technical critique of mainstream economics is found in another book published in 2014 entitled The Irreconcilable Inconsistencies of Neoclassical Macroeconomics, a False Paradigm. He has advised governments on macroeconomic policy, most recently the Central Bank of Zambia. His recent research work has involved analyzing capital flight from sub-Saharan countries in an African Development Bank project, cross-country analysis of so-called structural deficits published in this year's review of political economy, and the global pattern of the post-2008 Great Recession. His non-technical articles frequently appear on Open Democracy, Conversation UK, Pleria, and the Real News Network. And he has a blog column in the Huffington Post. And tonight he's going to talk to us about acute deficit disorder, cause, treatment, and cure. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I particularly want to thank Philip, in addition to his extremely important empirical and theoretical work. He has been a consistent patron of people with heterodox ideas, and as a result has made our profession stronger. And so therefore it is an honor to be here and speak. I'll cover three topics. First off, to say in May there's going to be an election in which austerity will be a major issue, at least I certainly hope it is. And so first I'm going to deal with it, present some facts. Then I'll make some theoretical points, and I'll finish up by saying what we need to do. I think I can, let me see if I'm clever enough. Yes, there we are. The other two books that Philip referred to. Before beginning, I might set the context. The other day, about 2 months ago, I was at a dinner meeting in which there were a number of people discussing austerity policies in Europe. And I said that in almost every country in the European Union, in the Eurozone and out of it, that deficits were a problem of growth. And that if the economy grew, they would generate more tax revenue, and generate tax revenue faster would generate expenditure. So someone in the audience raised his hand or around this table, and he didn't even raise his head, he just said, "Oh, John, that's just Keynesian economics." So I said to him, if I had said that the earth goes around the sun, not the other way around, would you have said, oh, that's just Copernican astronomy? No, the idea that deficits decline as the economy grows is not Keynesian economics. It's good sense. It's a recognition that the economy is demand constrained. And you might say that the difference between the mainstream of profession and those who are outside of the mainstream or on the edges of it is that mainstream economics, even among the best, even among the most progressively minded, such as Joseph Stiglitz, make arguments that derive from a full employment framework. That is, prices are parametric. Even the definition of economics that most people put forward derives from the view that the economy is at full employment. Economics is a study of the allocation of scarce resources among competing ends. Well, it shouldn't be, because what that statement says is that we are always having to make choices in order to allocate resources which are fully being used, and there's no slack in the system, so it's all about making those hard decisions about where to allocate the resources. In fact, the hard decisions in market economies is how to mobilize all the available resources. And that pretty much was what people considered economics to be 30 or 40 years ago. And some of the people who viewed it that way were called Keynesians, and others called themselves something different. But enough of that. But in that, having said that, I took a photograph about 3 or 4 years ago, which sums up my view of the recession and austerity. This was a young man at the famous park in New York during the Occupy movement, and he, I would say, had the idea of what was needed correct. Deficit disorder. Well, I'm going to begin with, I could have started with a quotation from George Osborne, or from the Prime Minister, but instead I think that the disorder is better shown by a quotation from the Shadow Chancellor, Ed Balls. Now, how did we get to the point where someone from an ostensibly progressive party would talk about credible commitments to deficit reduction, deficit elimination, not even reduction, elimination, iron discipline? So I suppose Mr. Balls thinks he would be an iron chancellor, this means making tough choices. How did we get to the point where people could say such flagrantly absurd things? And I hope that I'll be able to explain that after I've gone through a few facts. Why do we need the deficit down? It's because it is large and unmanageable. I wonder if there's any place left where undergraduates in economics are taught about government budgets. I'm not talking about public finance and tax incidents and things like that, but are taught, as I was, and probably Philip was, and some of the rest of you here, were taught, what's the overall budget, what's the primary budget, what's the cash flow budget, what difference does it make how you finance it, what's the net aggregate demand effect of the budget. None of these things come out in the press, or very, very rarely. And so I think one step towards understanding what to do about the deficit and whether we need to do anything about the deficit is you have to measure it correctly. And this gives us a simple example. This would be tax year 2013-14, so this is a little bit of past history, but not that past. The point it makes is would be the same with the latest statistics. It's something called the overall deficit, and that is basically the total programmed expenditure minus all the government revenues from different sources. I'm not even going to go into the primary deficit, which I don't have up here, is that deficit minus all interest payments, which is the deficit. If you go to the IMF manual on deficit, what it's called, I think it's called sound deficit, sound public finances, you'll see that the IMF recommends that you not use the overall deficit, which, by the way, is what is used in the European Union for the guideline, the famous 3% of GNP. Not use the overall deficit. You should be using the primary deficit, the overall deficit minus interest payments. And if anybody wants to ask why the IMF would suggest that, I'll be glad to talk about it later. But I'm more interested in another, to me, absolutely obvious misinterpretation of the deficit that relatively few people point out, and that is if you go to the next bar, which is minus 4% of GNP, that takes out the interest which the British government pays to itself, that is to the Bank of England. About 30% of the British debt is held by the Bank of England, so the payments service that part of the debt and payments to ourselves. And then there are other government agencies which also hold part of the deficit, so we're already down below 5% of, might say, expenditure that matters. Then quite a substantial portion of this deficit, 1.1 percentage points, is a result of the change in unemployment payments since 2008, which, as unemployment declines, will also decline. So that you might call we're getting closer to some kind of deficit that takes out the cyclical swings. And then if you take out investment, you're down to minus 1.6% of GNP. I want to make two comments on that before I go on. One is, when businesses want to invest, they don't build up a pile of cash, or at least they haven't in about 200 years. They go and borrow the money. And why do they borrow the money? The reason they borrow the money is because they know that if the investment is profitable, then it will produce a flow of income which will pay for itself. So therefore, if you paid for the investment up front, you'll be paying for it twice. You would have funded it, and then it would be funding itself. Why doesn't that apply to governments? Well, actually, it should. If an investment is profitable, it should be funded by borrowing. With one exception, with a very important analytical exception, and that is there might be circumstances when that would generate excess aggregate demand. So if you're close to full potential, the economy's potential, then a government has to be very cautious about funding investment through borrowing. Not because that it is unsound in and of itself, but because it can have inflationary effects. That's the type of economics that I learned, back in the antediluvian days, and it seems to me to be absolutely obvious that it makes sense. It makes sense to businesses. People always say, oh, well, the government should be run like a business. I agree 100%. When it wants to invest, it should borrow, just like businesses do. Okay, what is the point of this diagram? The first point is that the deficit is a complicated thing. We haven't even got into how it's being financed, so we haven't even discussed whether or not the net demand effect. I would say, when you get down to minus 1.6% of GNP, it's probably having a neutral effect in terms of aggregate demand, but that is a very intricate empirical question. So the first problem is that Once you analyze the deficit and look at the parts, it's not much of a problem. Why do we have it? Well, we all know why we have it. Of course, because the deficit, it's labor's reckless spending that caused the problem, and that now the coalition must sort that problem out. Let me say that I'm not a defender of labor's record under either Tony Blair or Gordon Brown. However, I do have a certain belief in the use of statistics and facts. And if you look at the numbers, I'm sorry this has looked a bit messy, but maybe you can read it from where you are. On the left-hand side, expenditure and revenue are measured in billions of pounds. On the right-hand side, the fiscal balance is measured in billions of pounds. If you go back from the second quarter of 2006 up to the last days of the Labour government, it had a negative balance of 439 billion pounds. This is in constant prices. So about 440 billion pounds. If you take the same period of time since the coalition came into power, and you measure up to today, well, not up to today, through the third quarter of last year, the net balance is minus 525 billion pounds. Now think about that for a moment. Despite the fact that the Labour government faced the worst recession in decades, it had a lower accumulative deficit on expenditure than the coalition has since the crisis. Now, why is that? The reason is obvious. It's because, to me, because the economy has stagnated. And that's what I move to next. The coalition inherited a stagnant economy. As a result of this economic stagnation, it was extremely difficult to lower get the public finances in order, and this decline was larger than any other major European country, and this is the burden which George Osborne had to bear. It's not true. If you look at the final days of the Brown government, you see that the growth rate was improving continuously up until the third quarter of 2010, and then began to deteriorate. The reason it was improving was because of fiscal stimulus, so-called Keynesian economics. Now, it is true that there has been a recovery which began in the early part of 2013, but it came after a quite prolonged stagnation, which was the result of pursuing expenditure cutting policies. And I'll come back to this, but now I want to move to the idea that there's a robust recovery going on, because it's not true. And the source is none other than the Office of National Statistics. If you go to the economic review of the Office of National Statistics from about a year and a half ago, they had a diagram they had this diagram, though it only went through 19 quarters because when it came out, I've now extended it to 25 quarters. What this shows is the output compared to the peak of each cycle before the downturn came. So in the case of 1973, the peak was came in the second quarter. Then you got a recession. Then you began to get at some point to get a recovery. In 1979 began the second quarter. In 1990 began the second quarter. 2008 it began the first quarter. Yes, we're back to where we were at the beginning of the recession, and it is the slowest recovery on record. Not only is it slightly slow, we are the slowest that's on that, the second slowest, the peak output is regained in the 17th quarter after the beginning of the downturn, and we're regained it this time around at the 25th. So if you work that out, that's about 2 years slower than the slowest recovery. Now you can say, well, this is a small sample, it's only 4 recoveries. However, the difference is so striking. A difference of 2 years, a recovery that comes that much later, that is not accidental, I would argue. Now, there are a number of arguments made about why deficits are a bad thing, why something should be done about them, and I would like to touch on those because I'm going to argue that they are all either false or conditional. So one argument is that the deficit generates an unsustainable public debt. I haven't marshaled the numbers on this. If you're interested, I can provide you with something that I've written and something that things other people have written. When you look at the British debt, you'll see that it is actually much smaller than the headline, because there's a difference between what is called the gross debt of the public sector and the net debt of the public sector. The net debt takes out certain cash assets, such as foreign exchange held in the Bank of England and other. We're not talking about the value of nationalized companies, but actual cash assets. It's well below 100% of GNP, and it's not increasing. That's the first argument that's frequently made. The second argument, which is stressed, is a crowding out argument. That is the idea that when the British government borrows, that leaves less for the private sector to borrow. And so it's like, you're taking you're waiting for an elevator, the elevator opens up, absolutely packed. You can only get in if somebody gets out. And that's what happens close to full employment. Then if the government or anybody, or households, or the private sector, businesses try to borrow, the consequence will be that one of the other major players must borrow less. Okay. But if the elevator door opens, elevator's half empty, then you can get in and nobody will be crowded out. And here, the evidence is absolutely clear. I take this just through the more recent data has become available, but this goes through the October of last year. And we see, first of all, that the return on Treasury bills is minuscule. I mean, in real terms, it's negative. It has hardly changed. And the relationship between the US dollar and the pound has hardly changed either. This is partly because of the problems with the euro, so that the pound has become a haven that investors or speculators, if we can call them by what they are, seek. So there's no evidence that public borrowing has had any impact either on the exchange rate or on borrowing rates. Okay, so why is it necessary to bring the deficit down? It can't be as the explanation for. I mean, we don't have evidence of rising bond prices. We don't have evidence of instability about the currency. On the contrary, the currency is now improving. So where are we left? Well, one frequently made argument is about a structural deficit, and I would like to spend a bit of time on that. Philip mentioned a paper of mine which came out in the Review of Political Economy with a special issue on the Eurozone crisis, and in that I tried to, what I'm about to say, I look out for 6 European Union countries, all in the Eurozone. The argument for structural deficit goes like this. Over the cycle, revenues rise and fall. And expenditures rise and fall. We saw, towards the beginning of the talk, I pointed out that part of the deficit was a result of increase in unemployment payments. They'll go down as the economy recovers. Okay, the structural deficit, I would be interested to know if anyone is aware of when that term was first used, because I've tried to chase it down, but I've chased down when it was first used in by the European Commission. And that was several years ago, but it didn't actually become formally part of the policy until the passage of what's frequently called the Fiscal Pact. And the argument goes like this. Imagine that the British economy were to move from its current position at less than full capacity, less than full potential, that it were to jump to full potential. If at that point there is a deficit in public finances, it is a structural deficit. There's a structural deficit is that deficit which would exist if we were at full employment under current parameters. And that is a problem because we should have, well, I guess it's a problem because it exists. I find it very difficult to figure out why even that would be a problem. But if you had the view that you ought to balance the budget over the cycle, then a structural deficit is a problem. George Osborne uses this term. He repeatedly talks about the structural deficit. You see it in the press. Even a very good business economics journalist, Larry Elliott, uses the term. It's complete nonsense. And for many reasons, it's not difficult to explain why. Go to the European Union website and look for the explanation of how the structural deficit is measured. You'll find out that, what should be obvious, there must be an estimate at any moment of what full employment or full potential would be. So therefore, we can only talk about what the public sector balance would be at full potential if we have an estimate of what full potential is. And you'll discover that there are two ways in which that is measured. There is the production function method, which is what they use in the European Union, and it is, I'm almost embarrassed to say, they use a simple Cobb-Douglas production function to estimate what output would be if everyone who wants work had work at existing levels of productivity. But even that is quite problematical, because you need even if you accepted the production function approach to estimating what output would be at different levels of employment, and I don't, but even if you did, you would have to have some mechanism for estimating what maximum employment is. So you've got two things that you have to estimate, both of which are very problematical. One is the link between output and employment, and the other is maximum employment. As I understand, in the case of the Treasury, here this is, I haven't been able to actually get a hold of the document, but the estimate is based upon a concept of the natural rate of unemployment. So there's an estimate of what would be the rate of unemployment that would lead to a stable rate of inflation, non-accelerating rate of inflation. Again, a very problematical concept, because it involves the concept of a natural rate of unemployment, or that there's a rate of unemployment, a unique rate of unemployment associated with zero inflation or no change in the rate of inflation. But there's a further problem here. Say you granted all of that. and you calculated it out, and you said, well, if we were close to full employment suddenly, the fiscal deficit, the overall fiscal deficit would be 3% of GNP. Well, we know empirically that under unchanged parameters of expenditure and taxes, revenue grows faster than expenditure grows when output grows. So if output were growing at 3%, we know that revenue would grow faster than expenditure unless there were new expenditure programs put in place. But of course, the idea of a structural deficit assumes that you have unchanged expenditure and revenue parameters. So that means if you have a structural deficit under this definition Suddenly we jump to full employment and we discover we have 3%. All you have to do is wait, because sooner or later the deficit will be eliminated. And that, in the paper that I did in Review of Political Economy, basically I attempted to measure that. I asked the question, given the present deficit, and this given journals, this was data way back in for 2011. Given available data, given normal growth rates, how long would it take each country to eliminate its deficit? And it turns out that they're all less than, the answer to all of them is less than 3 years, with the exception of Greece. Greece was the only country for which a much longer period would be required to eliminate the deficit. And that's why it was the first country to suffer a crisis of public finances. Okay, so where are we left here? We're saying is that this concept of fiscal deficit comes from a particular view, a static view of the economy, that the deficit is something which is independent of any dynamic process, and it must be eliminated within sort of that static analytical framework. Now, at this point I'll try to finish up with a few insights, well, I hope they're insights, or suggestions for where we go from here. First, I think that at this moment, economists have a particular responsibility to try to render the debate about public finances in a more rational and reasonable context, and to try to shift discussion from this very narrow view that a deficit is a problem that must be eliminated. On the face of it, it's a problem, and debt is a problem, and therefore steps need to be taken to eliminate these problems. This is getting very close to a use of the word debt and deficit similar to in German. In German, the same word for guilt and debt, and that's been pointed out by many people, and many people have suggested, well, maybe this is a problem with the Bundesbank. But if we could get out of the idea that deficits are a bad thing, when you come to a recession, deficits are a good thing. Deficits were not the problem in 2010. The fiscal deficit was the solution, not the problem, in the sense that through the recession generating a fiscal deficit, it softened the decline of the economy, because it meant that outflows, leakages, as we used to call them, were less than injections, so that the rate at which the government was contributing its net contribution to aggregate demand was rising as the recession proceeded. And that's what a deficit is. It shows a growing net contribution by the public sector to aggregate demand. All right, so I finish by saying I urge you to write to your MP, write to your local newspaper, try to generate a view of public finances which is a rational one in which deficits and debt aren't viewed as insurmountable, are problems that must be surmounted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for a comprehensive analysis.